Good afternoon. It is the afternoon now. I just looked at the clock. We're at 3:30. For all of you that are just joining us, welcome. Welcome to Vote Local Day 2022. We are thrilled you're here and thank you for being with us today. My name is Kate Mayer. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the director and founder of Be the Ones. A quick few housekeeping things before we get started on this panel. This is a nonpartisan event. This is being recorded, which you may have seen or heard. Attendees are not on camera. Our panelists obviously are. So you don't have to worry about if you got that second, third cup of coffee today, you're not on camera. And then we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have questions, answers, comments, anything, go ahead and either throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to those towards the end. So let's go ahead and dig in. This is a conversation I'm thrilled to be part of today and having with you. And before we get started in kind of like the meat and potatoes of the conversation, I'm going to ask you each to just introduce yourself. And let's start with Alexis.
Hi, yes, my name is Alexis Wynn-Coleman. I go by she and her. I am from Fredericksburg, Virginia. I am a Virginia voter. I'm also an intern for Deliver My Vote. So yeah.
You can decide who to pass it to.
Amanda.
Well, hello, my name is Amanda Pohl. I'm the executive director with Deliver My Vote. I also happen to live in Virginia, but we're a national organization, so we work all across the country. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Kate, for having us. And I'll pass it to Cecilia to fill out our group.
Hi, y'all. My name is Cecilia Silva. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. I am a board member for Deliver My Vote, and in my 9-to-5 capacity, I am a political and electoral consultant.
Hi, everyone. Happy Vote Local Day. My name is Lauren Kunis. I'm the executive director at Vote Riders. Like Deliver My Vote, we're a national organization, but I'm joining you all today from Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Got a not full East Coast, but semi East Coast panel going on. So let's go ahead and dig in because we have a lot to talk about. There is a lot of progress. We've been talking about that a lot today. Progress, intentionality around vote by mail, about making voting easier. And we got a lot to get through. So let's go ahead and just get started. Amanda, I'm going to start with you. Would you briefly set the stage for us in terms of vote by mail? And we know every state has different laws and processes, but what is vote by mail and why is it such an important tool to improve voter participation and for our democracy?
Yeah. So when we say vote by mail, we're speaking very broadly. A lot of times you'll hear that term when people mean absentee ballots, when people mean early voting. For us, it really is voting by mail. It is voting by actual mail, right? Where you get your mail-in ballot, it's shipped to you. You fill it out at home. You put some states require a stamp, others don't. Put it back in the mailbox and it goes back to the electoral office. In other places, there's opportunities for you to vote early. They have drop boxes in some states where you can drop off your ballot. Really, it's about voter choice and making votes more accessible. And so what we have found in our research and why we think vote by mail is so important, and just to tell you all, the reason we use vote by mail is honestly, it's what everybody calls it. So if you look out there, there's been some of us in this community that have tried things like, hey, maybe we should be more inclusive and call it vote at home. So we've tried that. The hashtag has not taken off. So absentee, we've tried absentee voting or early voting. Those hashtags haven't either. When we say vote by mail, most people are talking about that early voting before Election Day. But to tell you, it is really important, because these vote by mail programs and any early voting program does provide greater access to the ballot. And that supports the basic foundation of our democracy. And that is something that we are standing for, is making sure that we have that access and the choices. And those accessible programs do increase access to voting for disenfranchised communities especially. And we have some research that we did and released in February that also shows that young voters, and especially voters of color, are more likely to vote if they're given vote by mail options, and low propensity voters, so the people who don't vote as often, or those who they may unlikely voters, right? The infrequent unlikely voters, those folks are 10 times more likely to cast a ballot if they had applied for a mail-in ballot. So it's a really important part of the process, and we've seen it increasing. We've seen vote by mail numbers increasing over the years, but we know that if we give opportunities to folks to vote early, they will.
You mentioned some really interesting stats, and I know Deliver My Vote has been kind of on the forefront of research and data, especially in the last 2 to 4 years. Do you find that vote by mail is? I was laughing at the hashtag. It's not a new concept, but it's a new term, if you will. And I think we've had this conversation before that there is very little research in certain areas that haven't been. I'm going to totally coin this phrase, hashtagable. We're going with it. We're going to use that going forward. Did you find that, before you kind of started all of this research within the last 4 years, was there not a lot out there, or was it, what's kind of changed in the research and the data from, the last 4 years to previous cycles?
Yeah, I've got to give credit where credit is due, and to say that there are a lot of scholars who are interested in early voting and vote by mail and have been for a long time. What we saw in 2020 was something that, of course, we hadn't seen before, right? It was a confluence of circumstances all hitting at the same time. We had a very large presidential election with arguably, two candidates that were, on completely different ends of the spectrum. So very widely publicized opportunities there. We had, since 2016, there has been a lot more political engagement, especially from women who were distraught about the results of the 2016 election. So we're seeing that. So 2020 was this big election. And then on top of that, right, like we had COVID-19 pandemic, which frightened a lot of people and worried, I mean, myself included, right? Like we were worried about like catching, this horrible pandemic and getting sick, passing it on to someone that we love, or, having long-term consequences. So with all of that in mind, we know that people wanted to vote by mail more because they wanted more options to say, okay, I don't want to stand in a long line of people. I don't know what y'all's polling places look like. My old one in 2020, there weren't a whole ton of people, but it's a very small location and not very well ventilated, right? So I certainly didn't want to stand in that small space with a bunch of people. And I know a lot of folks felt that way. And if you saw the long lines, for many years we've been seeing, I mean, ACLU has been publicizing this stuff forever. We see these long lines. But in 2020, we had, kind of this mass, like collective, we're all going to do this, right? And so just so you all know, for non-traditional voting, and that includes vote by mail, early absentee, also all the types of early voting, non-election day voting, it was it accounted for 69.4% of our vote in 2020. Yeah, and that's the highest that it's ever been, right? So there is a renewed interest in this type of voting, and what we saw in that data was not just that it was, a bunch of people who were doing it. We had the highest turnout election in modern history. We had more people of color and young people voting than we've ever had, more young people and people of color using non-traditional voting methods, and more people accessing the ballot who, would otherwise not have accessed it. What we saw after that, and I promise I'll wrap it up in a minute, but what we saw after that was we saw that people were, as soon as those things happened, right? As soon as we see more people of color, as soon as we see more young people, as soon as we see more folks coming and accessing their ballot and choosing, exercising their right to vote, we immediately saw states starting to clamp down on voting methodologies, right? So they were saying, oh, wait, actually, we're going to pull back on this. Yeah. So, and Lauren's, I'm sure, going to share some about this, but what they saw was they said, we're gonna, we're gonna make sure that, we eliminate all these drop boxes. Look at Georgia, right? Like, we're gonna make you, in Virginia, we didn't have to have a witness signature in 2020 because, who wanted to go talk to their neighbors in the middle of a pandemic? They brought that back, which is, that's probably benign and minor. But just thinking about all the things that people are trying to do in other states, they completely outlawed drop boxes and said they were unconstitutional, right? So there's a lot of different stuff that's been happening, and I would say that what we're seeing that, yes, we're increasing participation when we do vote by mail. And so we're also seeing a backlash from legislators who don't want to see that increased participation. And there is some research that folks are working on around, like, does this really create more informed voters? We hypothesize that yes, because people have time to spend with their ballot. But we don't, we don't have the official data to say yes, people spend X number of minutes with their ballot, if they do it at home versus in the voting booth. But I know Alexis, I actually want to kind of get Alexis's perspective, because as a voter, you've seen some different things. So I know we kind of had this plan, but I would love, Alexis, if you want to share a little bit about what you've experienced as a voter, some of the barriers that you've seen.
I can say growing up as a child, like living in poverty in my community, I wasn't really influenced by the importance of voting within my household. So within a community, it was mostly like elderly people who participate in voting. And as I became a teen in my years, I was always told the importance of voting during that time was presidential elections. So this was important to our family as far as to let our voice be heard for a better change. So I could say just the lack of knowledge pertaining to voting was just basically what I experienced and what I've been around.
What changes have you seen shift in the last, let's just say the last 2 years, in terms of resources and knowledge and information? Have you seen a shift in terms of your own knowledge, and also just generally speaking, what's available?
I can say now, when I started as an intern at Deliver My Vote, just seeing that from that perspective of the organization, how so many different resources, how you can engage in with the tools and be educated about voting. So that was kind of new for me. And like I said, being an intern, so it really just opened my eyes to a whole different level of voting, which today I participated in an event trying to encourage individuals in my community to register to vote or donate. And today actually worked out. So I'm just glad that I was able to advocate from that perspective, and to just show them, me being a young person engaged in voting, how voting is important to your voting count. So it was nice today.
Congratulations. That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
I don't know if this panel and conversation is going to top that. I'll just put that out right now, but that's awesome. Congratulations. And thank you. Thank you. Lauren, let's talk a little bit about voter IDs. Obviously a lot, I think what we just talked about, Amanda talked about, probably applies somewhat to the voter ID landscape. Can you just share a little bit for those that may not be familiar with voter ID laws across the country? Kind of where do we stand, and give us the good data.
Yeah, I don't know if it's good data, but I'm happy to share lots of data on voter ID. So Vote Riders is a national nonpartisan organization that for 10 years has focused exclusively and specifically on the issue of voter ID. And the sort of big picture lay of the land when it comes to voter ID laws, if there's one thing everyone should know, it's that they're on the rise. So an estimated 40 million more Americans live in a state with a voter ID law right now in 2022 than did when we were founded in 2012. As with all things voting, as with voting by mail, as with everything, there's no one size fits all answer for me to say, like, this is the deal with voter ID in your state, in your locality. So shameless plug for Vote Riders. We have a really comprehensive and accessible site. If you go to voteriders.org/ID check, you can see what the voter ID laws are in your state when you go to the polls this fall. But big picture, 36 states have voter ID laws. Every single state has different rules. And as an additional layer of complication, voter ID laws are different often for voting by mail and voting in person. About 70% of Americans live in one of those 36 voter ID states. And what we see from our staff on the ground, from the voters that call our helpline or text our chatbot, voter ID laws are causing confusion everywhere, even if you live in a state that does not have a voter ID law. I live in DC, for example, which has no voter ID law. I cannot tell you how many times a friend or a neighbor is like, oh, I really want to vote for mayor because I really like or don't like what she's doing to the school system, but I can't. I haven't switched over my driver's license from, and I'm like, no, you don't need it. And everyone's kind of like, wait, really? I don't? So it's important to be an educated and confident and empowered voter on the issue of voter ID, no matter where you live. That being said, if you do live in one of the 36 voter ID law states, you will be either required or requested to present an ID, depending on your state's laws, when you go to the polls and or when you vote by mail. And that can include on your vote by mail application, as well as on your ballot itself. In some states, that looks like writing in the last 4 digits of your driver's license number, for example, the last 4 digits of your social. In other states, you actually have to include a photocopy of your ID with your mail-in ballot application. We had a whole program we stood up in 2020 around exactly that, because in the midst of a pandemic, who had access to, sometimes a printer or a photocopier? Another thing to note on the sort of like vote by mail, voter ID, Venn diagram intersection, if you will, is that in 2020, as Amanda was saying, coming out of that election, we saw some very misleading narratives and political targeting of the act of voting by mail. So 12 states passed new or stricter voter ID laws since 2020. About half of those specifically had to do with IDs for voting by mail. So the sort of active vote by mail has become a political target, if you will, and many states have sort of honed in on that and added new ID requirements to the vote by mail process. And as Amanda was saying, also millions, tens of millions of Americans voted by mail in 2020 for the first time, and we're like, this is great. It's convenient. It's accessible. I don't have to wait online in the rain for 3 hours with my 2 whiny kids. Maybe that's just me. That actually happened. But the rules of the game are going to look different when it comes to voter ID for voting by mail. For millions of Americans, since they last paid attention, things have changed. 2 very quick examples of this come from Georgia and Texas. Georgia passed new ID requirements for voting by mail as part of its sweeping voting legislation in 2021. As a result, over 157,000 registered Georgia voters are no longer able to vote by mail because they don't have an ID on file with the state. So we've been doing everything we can to text and write letters to and otherwise contact these voters so that they know the method that they might have used for voting in 2020 is going to be more challenging for them, and they need to get prepared. Another example is Texas. Texas also passed sweeping voting restrictions as part of a legislative action in 2021 that added new ID requirements for voting by mail as well. What we saw in the March primary in Texas was that an unprecedented number of vote by mail applications and ballots themselves were rejected because of the new ID requirements. So these laws are causing confusion. They're causing powerful barriers to lots of eligible Americans to cast a ballot in a way that is their preferred way, or a way that they'd like to explore, having been exposed to that in 2020. So lots going on the voter ID front, and particularly as it comes to vote by mail, which is why I think it's so exciting that we're sort of able to combine these 2 topics in conversation today.
Yeah, I think there's the confusion, do I even need an ID or not, right? Which is like the most basic question, yet the hardest in many places. And then there's so many layers under that, right? I mean, I do a lot of work here in South Carolina, and I've had numerous conversations with folks that we are a voter ID state, have moved, right? And they don't realize, they've got to get a new ID. I've been a poll worker. I've had to turn people away to go to another poll location because of their ID doesn't match. And so I think, there's so many layers and misconceptions under that. Not to mention that, in some states, your signature form, your voter ID form, has to match your original ID or your original application, right? Depending on your state, it's all these complexities. And it's like, I was talking to someone, I was like, I never write the same signature from day one to day two, let alone a form I filled out 10 years ago. And it's extremely ableist and ageist. And it's, just another barrier. And I'd love to hear some of the misconceptions that you hear and your team at Vote Riders in terms of voter IDs.
Yeah, so there are a bunch. I mean, the first is, and you sort of alluded to this, voter registration and voter ID are different. And the documents that you use to register to vote may not be acceptable ID for voting purposes.
Yeah.
So getting registered is the first step in every single state and DC, except for North Dakota, which doesn't require voter registration. But getting registered is the first step, but in 36 states with voter ID laws, it may not be enough. So it's really important for voters to understand the difference between voter registration and voter ID. And then know that voter ID can be different for in-person or voting by mail. Yeah. But frankly, a big misconception that I come across a lot when we talk about voter ID, most people have some form of ID. And it's, without sort of digging into the weeds of what's acceptable in a given state, everyone is like, oh, that's not a big deal. I have to use an ID to, buy alcohol at the grocery store or pick up my tickets at will call. But the thing is, many people have an ID, but it may not be acceptable for voting purposes in their state. In lots of states, a student ID is not acceptable for voting purposes. If it is an expired license, it's not acceptable in certain states. The Brennan Center did a study in 2006 that we've since sort of adjusted for current census figures. That study found that an estimated 11% of voting age Americans did not have current government issued photo ID, which is the one type of ID that works in every single voter ID state. Looking at current census figures, that works out to about 25 million eligible Americans who should be able to exercise their fundamental freedom to vote, but may not be able to because of voter ID laws. And these voter ID laws don't hit all communities equal. So an estimated 1 in 4 Black Americans does not have that form of ID that I mentioned. About 20% of youth, students, the same percentage of seniors who are over 65 who are less likely to drive, people who live in cities. I know the earlier panel was about challenges to voting for the trans and non-binary community. They also have significant challenges with voter ID laws when their gender doesn't present in a way that reconciles with their voter registration. Women who change their names when they marry or divorce often find themselves sort of surprised, tripped up by voter ID laws when they get to the polls. So, I think the biggest misconception about voter ID laws is that they don't depress turnout and they don't deter people from going to the polls, and they don't outright prevent eligible Americans from casting a ballot. Because we know from a decade of experience and lots of studies that they do.
Not to plug Be the Ones for a second, but I think, we're talking a lot about laws and policies, right? And I think a lot of what folks don't have access to information or know because there's lack of information is that it's not just the laws and policies, right? It's the law is only as good as the law. And it's the thousands of other people under our legislators that are actuating and implementing, right? And so we'll comment just on what you were saying. Our county clerks in our many, again, states different, all different things, but generally speaking, county clerks are the ones that are in charge of our vital documents. What is the process? What's the payment? What is it online? Is it not? In terms of how we change our gender markers on documents, birth certificates, divorce decrees, all of those things that I think we elect these people, right? So it's the laws are important, but when we think about all of the process and the time and the money, it's really our local elected leaders that are deciding their time and resources, which are usually very underfunded, to put towards that, right? And so as we start to approach November, where there are thousands and thousands of county clerks on the ballot, that's something to think through. Of this isn't just a voter ID law or not, it's what else is happening at the local level.
Oh, absolutely. And like when it comes to ID issuing offices like the DMV, what are their hours? Where are they located? What kind of accessibility do they have? It really all comes down to sort of local implementation of bureaucratic processes like that.
Yeah, I'm going to pass it to you to Cecilia in a second. But I was recently trying to get some information from a county in rural North Carolina, and they only would request by fax machine. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, first of all, who has a fax machine at this day and age? But what a barrier, right? I mean, if that's the only way they receive requests from their constituents and outside of, folks that are trying to reach them, that in and of itself is a decision that county clerk has made to receive all communication only by fax machine. Maybe want to pull out my Rolodex, which now I'm like totally dating us on this conversation. But Cecilia, you have been on the front lines for years in the electoral space, and been on the ground talking and working with folks in Texas and Michigan and all over the country. What do you see and what do you hear when you are, talking to voters, and give us a kind of that perspective, if you will, in terms of voting and barriers to the ballot?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of like disheartened feelings towards voting in general, and then being able to participate in our like democracy. People feel discouraged. They feel like all these restrictions exist intentionally targeting them, so it makes them less wanted or willing to participate. So some of the things that we've kind of been working with different campaigns is teaching our organizers on the ground who are knocking on doors, talking directly to voters, is basically sharing like personal stories, right? Talking about how this all comes down to each election matter, and every elected official has an influence in your day-to-day activities, and that at the end of the day, all things are political, and all things political are personal. So we hear a lot of discouragement, we hear a lot of confusion, we hear a lot of misconception. So it's really on the organizers on the ground to kind of provide that clarification and those resources, which I think is also why there are lots of restrictions in different states around what campaigns can and cannot say to voters, right? So there are lots of candidates who, when they send their volunteers to go talk to voters, they can't help you fill out a voter registration card. They can't tell you what your voter registration status is. They can only tell you that you have voted in the past, and we have your voting record because that's public information, but there are lots of strict rules around it. I think it's also very difficult whenever you have states like Texas where, 11,000 voters are being purged every few years. And all of these individuals are being targeted just based off of random misconceptions that the Secretary of State has like targeted voters based off of. I mean, just this past March, I have voted in every single election since I turned 18, local, statewide, midterm. And when I went to go vote, I was told I'd have to fill out like a promissory ballot because my voter registration status hadn't been verified. So even though I had my voter registration card with all of my stamps that shows I'm an active voter, I had my ID information and my voter identification number, I was still asked to fill out a different ballot. So I think having those experiences and those stories is what we're hearing a lot from voters themselves. They're talking about how discouraged they feel, how they don't really know what answer is right and what answer is wrong. And then even times we hear the aftermath from whenever they do go vote in person and talk to a poll worker who turned them away. And the problem there is that poll workers are all volunteers who are paid one day of the year to go and participate in that job, right? They're not experts in the field most of the time. They're individuals who are passionate about democracy and want to, be a part of fair election system, but they don't actually know all the ins and outs. They don't know what the legislative system has enforced, what is applicable and no longer applicable. And those training programs to prepare poll workers are only 2 to 4 hours max, right? So individuals feel like not only are there lots of challenges before I even go vote, but then once I get there, I don't know what to expect. I don't know what's coming out of this issue. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about the work that Deliver My Vote does, because when we engage people early, there's opportunity for education to happen, right? We don't have strong civics programs in most states, and definitely not for K through 12 individuals. So by providing them that opportunity to participate with vote by mail, then they have a way to get involved and engaged and educated. And they also allows for a more fair election system, because individuals can do that research themselves. They're not waiting to see if someone's going to come knock on their doors and talk to them about this. And I think in a lot of those instances, that would make a large difference in our voter turnout rates, because people feel like it's easy for them to get involved. If it's something that they automatically get in their mail, they can open up, look at, take the time while they're at their lunch break, or after school when they're waiting to pick up their kids in the carpool lane, whatever it may be. They feel like there are more opportunities for them to make an educational decision that they feel confident and comfortable making. Because we also hear that people feel like they shouldn't vote because they don't know everything that's going on, and they feel like they shouldn't be voting on things that they're not educated properly on. So definitely feel like there are lots of issues where we're actively engaging with direct needs and services, while also trying to address those systemic barriers as a whole and how we create positive change for everyone.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's most beautifully eloquently said in one statement. I totally agree. I think, we talked a little bit about challenges, and we know that we have obviously a long road ahead of us and a lot to overcome. I'd love to hear from each of you just one thing that you feel is the biggest change or the biggest needle mover area of progress that you've seen. I'm not sure if needle mover is the right word, but we're going to go with it. At this hour, we're going to hashtag it and throw words out. But one area that you've seen the biggest change or the area of progress since 2020, if you had to pick one thing.
I'm happy to start, and I'll say that for the research that we're showing is showing that, and what is encouraging to me is seeing how many young folks are voting. Like the number of young people voting is it more than doubled for the percentage of young people who voted between like 2020 or from 2016 to 2020, more than doubled, and we're seeing more young people than ever like going onto social media, using TikTok and Instagram and so forth to try to like really engage their peers and talk to them about voting and their options. And so for me, and our research bears this out as well, right? That we see that when young people have access to vote by mail, then we do know that they will vote more often. They will vote in likely more elections if they're able to. So, and with a average age of state elected officials at 56, and average age of people in local elections, about 60, right? But the median age of 77% of all US counties being at or below 44. Like we really need more young people out there voting and running for office as well. And I think we're starting to see that trend and seeing that shift more than we have in a while. So I'm encouraged by that.
I'm glad that you asked this question, because I feel like sometimes it's easy to be a little too doom and gloom when you look at the state of voting access and sort of where things are going in some places. But I think it's important to recognize that it is not going in that direction everywhere. So there are a handful of states that have passed legislation since 2020 that has actually made it easier to vote. New York State is a good example of that. A lot of states have, moved to make vote by mail, which was in 2020, sort of emergency legislation to temporarily expand access to vote by mail. They've moved to make it more permanently and universally accessible. But I think kind of zooming out, beyond the legislation that has been bright spots at certain state levels. In the last midterm elections, we saw the highest turnout in over a century. In 2020, again, we saw record-breaking turnout. And only time will tell what we see exactly 1 month from today. But I think I've been reading a lot of reports about, women in particular registering in huge numbers and the electorate becoming younger and more diverse. And I am cautiously optimistic and inspired hearing stories that to me indicate that in our country, we're sort of on this trend of greater and more equitable turnout in every election.
Alexis, I wanted to ask you, kind of not pivoting, adding on to what Lauren said, what do we, and Amanda as well, what do we need to do to get more people, especially young people, involved? And how do we see these trends continuing to go up? Because, what we don't want to happen is that we get past this point and then we kind of see the drop off again and then we peak again. What do we need to do? How do we get folks involved?
So young voters like myself, I feel that need to be more educated on the importance of voting. As of today, attending community events to learn what is needed in your neighborhoods, where voting could be made like a change or a difference. Also, to keep up with current events from the news and getting involved more so, again, like with your community and things like that. Stuff that I did not do in my teen years. I did not do that. I feel as though if I was like educated more and more knowledgeable as far as voting and how your vote count and how important your vote could be or is, then I feel like I would have made changes or it would have been different. So that's what I would say for like young voters.
Love that. We talked, I'm going to stick with progress because I feel like we're on this like high note now. Like we're going to keep, because good things are happening. We're going to keep going with it. So yeah, it's 2020, November 8th, 2024. What progress have we seen? What's happened with improving access to the ballot that makes you really excited if we were having this conversation to say, we have made this progress in the last 2 years? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I feel like there's a new sense of unity that has come from all of this work, not just on constituent side, but also on like the organization side, right? So I think that 2020 not only awoke a lot of individuals who had previously been living with politics way outside of their mind frame, but it's allowed for these organizations who we're all working individually in silos in their communities to come together. Right. So I think through that power of initiative and creating those connections, they were able to then target audiences at the same time, at different times, and voters feel a little bit more like those resources are accessible. So they know they're out there, they just don't know where to begin. And I think that the work is still getting better, right? There's always that opportunity for growth, but I think that's definitely something that I hear a lot when talking to voters. And I think that another reason why a lot of them are more engaged now is because they're seeing more representation in politics, right? So they're seeing more individuals who look like them, who look like their mothers, their fathers, their sisters. And when they see those individuals, they feel like there's an investment to the community because you share similarities with someone. So when that investment is clear and when it's made to you and you see it thrown at you all the time, people feel like it's easier for them to learn about an issue or a candidate and become passionate about that. So I think that the increased technology and digital era has created that, and also the forced solidarity that came out of the pandemic really allowed this unique opportunity for change to happen, not just at a small rate, but at an ongoing rate. And I think it's also taught a lot of people patience, right? So for a lot of people who were first-time voters and came out this time, they're being explained like, we work 6-9 months out of the year to elect someone, and then once they're elected, it's still a long road
Yeah.
before we see actual change, whether it be legislative or executive, depending on the position. So I think that by educating people on the way their democracy works, not only do they feel eager to participate, but then they feel eager to wait for that change because they know they've made a right decision on the person that they've elected to serve them.
I love that. Educating people on the way democracy works. I love that. Amanda, Alexis, I'm going to pass the question to you.
So I would say like 80% across the board to vote, whether it's by mail, at the home, or polls. More people would take more interest in the power of their vote. So that's what I would say, at least 80%.
I love that. I'm going to put 80% on a post-it, and then I'm going to put it in my calendar for 2 years from today, and I'm going to email you or text you and see where we're at. I know we can get there together. I know we are running a little short on time. There are two questions that came into my chat that I wanted to ask. I'm not sure, Jen asked, and I'm not sure who this is directed to, so I'm going to throw it to the group and you can answer. What gives you hope? So I'll let anyone answer that wants to.
I think it's a long road, but I think we're starting to see a shift in the culture of voting. You know, I think in 2020 in particular, you saw sports teams and large companies and brands and celebrities and people who previously would be sort of, you know, not political and not sort of take a stand or encourage people to vote in a completely nonpartisan way. You saw a lot of people sort of coming out of the woodwork, a lot of new and different actors coming out of the woodwork. And I think that's going to be so key to growing the electorate and not just mobilizing the people who vote in every direction. You know, if we want to bring new and different people into the fold politically, we're going to need to reach them through trusted messengers, and, you know, meet them where they already are. So to me, the sort of slow but steady shift in the culture of voting is what gives me hope.
I love that. I always love to ask and leave with an action item, because conversations are great, actions are where the real juice is. And so I'm going to ask each one of you, we can start, whoever wants to go first. Amanda, we'll start with you. What is one action that someone watching or listening today can take to improve voter access through vote by mail, or generally speaking, improve voter access? What's one thing they can do?
So I would say one thing you can do is check your state laws, right? Like figure out what you're able to do. What kind of state do you live in? Do you live in a state where you have to have an excuse to vote by mail? Well, you're not going to be able to vote by mail likely, right? Because the excuses are difficult sometimes. But if you do, like, get in contact with me. I'm happy to help you figure out if you have an excuse to to be able to vote by mail or vote absentee. But if you live in a state where you're on the permanent, you can get on the permanent vote by mail list, get on the list, right? Then you never have to worry about it. Every single election, your ballot will show up in your mailbox. They will just send it to you. So, so that's one thing that I would say, check your laws and get signed up on that list if you're there. And I'm going to put some links in the chat on how you can check your registration status and your, and request a vote by mail ballot.
And also, we are going to be circulating all of these links and all of this information as well. So everyone watching and listening, you're going to get all this goodness too. Lauren, I'm going to throw the question to you.
Yes, mine is similar to Amanda's, but transposed to the issue of voter ID. Make sure you know what the voter ID laws are for voting in person and by mail, or if your state has a voter ID law in the first place, which some do not. I just dropped the link in the chat, but you can go to voteriders.org/ID check to see the most updated information on that front. And then make sure to share the word in your community. You know, all of us are uniquely powerful in getting information to a few people, in mobilizing a few people and giving them the extra nudge. So once you've sort of got your own house in order and made sure you know what the rules are for voting in your state, make sure that you share that with your community.
Absolutely. Cecilia, I'm going to turn it to you next.
Yeah, so I think that, speaking for Texans and Michigandans, I keep getting that wrong. I'll get it right one day. So I would say the first thing is starting those conversations with the people who don't want to talk politics at the dinner table and asking them, hey, are you registered to vote? When's the last time you checked your voter registration status? So for those Texans on the line, you have until Tuesday to make sure that your voter registration status is up to date and to learn more about where you should be going on election day or during early voting dates. And for our Michiganders, that's what it is, you have until October 24th. So it's important to be aware of those deadlines as they're coming close to us and just actively be sharing that information. It's 2022. We do not gatekeep information around voting. We want everyone to participate and be involved.
Yep. Alexis, close us out.
Yes, so use your voice for a change, whether that's research, whether that's resources for voter ID laws, voter registrations. I actually learned about voter ID laws and voter registrations today. I didn't know they were so different. So if people become aware of that, I feel like things could be easier as a voter.
I love that. I don't know how I even follow anything after that comment. I knew it was going to be something where I was like, oh, I feel no follow this. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being with us today and sharing all of this information, stories of progress, stories of hope. I am excited to do this again, whether it's November 8th or another day in October in 2024, and look back at this conversation and see, where we've gone in the next 2 years. So thank you. And even more importantly, thank you for all of the work that you're doing to improve access to the ballot in your communities with your friends and family. I really, really appreciate all of the work that you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Absolutely.